Have you ever heard of the Samaritans in the Bible? Maybe you've come across the well-known parable of the Good Samaritan. We're going to unpack who the Samaritans really were, why they were so despised by the Jews, and why that hatred ran so deep it outlived empires. And even more fascinating, we'll explore where they are now. Do the Samaritans still exist? And if so, what's become of their legacy? It's a beautiful story. A man lying on the roadside, passed by religious elites, only to be rescued by someone society looked down on. But here's the thing, behind that one parable lies a history far deeper, more painful, and more profound than most people realize. In this video, we're going on a journey into an ancient rivalry, into centuries of division, betrayal, and spiritual tension. The nation of Israel once stood together under a single crown, first with Saul, then David, and later Solomon. But when Solomon died, something cracked. Stay with me, because this story will challenge not just your understanding of history, but perhaps your understanding of reconciliation, purity, and spiritual pride. The people pleaded with him to ease their burdens, but he refused, and so began a rebellion that split the kingdom in two, despite warnings from prophets. The people hardened their hearts, and then judgment came, the roots of a nation divided for 3 agonizing years. The people held out. Hunger gnawed at their strength. Families were torn apart, and when the city finally fell, the Assyrians did what they were known for. They didn't just conquer, they erased. Let's rewind time. Way before Jesus walked the dusty roads of Judea, before Rome spread its iron grip over Israel, there was unity. In their place, the Assyrians imported foreign tribes to resettle the land, a brilliant but cruel strategy to destroy any hope of rebellion. But in 586 BCE, they were crushed, this time by Babylon. Jerusalem was sacked, the temple burned to the ground, the people were exiled to a foreign land. For 70 years, the Jewish people lived in captivity, dreaming of home. But they weren't the only ones in the land. When they approached the Jews and offered to help rebuild the temple, it seemed like an olive branch. Their king, Jeroboam, even set up golden calves, symbols borrowed from paganism, and introduced practices that blended worship of Yahweh with foreign rituals. Their religion blended remnants of Mosaic law with pagan traditions. They feared the God of Israel, but they also kept their old idols. And for the Jews in Judah, this was spiritual pollution. They had suffered exile for forsaking their God, and they weren't going to risk that again. Only those who had remained faithful, they believed, should have a hand in rebuilding the sacred temple. 2 tribes remained in the south, forming the kingdom of Judah, centered around Jerusalem and the sacred temple. What was once one chosen nation was now a house divided, not just geographically, but theologically. His son Rehoboam took the throne, but unlike his father, he ruled with a hardened heart and an iron hand. Instead of wisdom, he chose arrogance. The churches stood just blocks apart, same denomination, same creed, but one had embraced a more progressive path while the other clung to tradition. And in the middle of that theological rift, families had split, friendships fractured, and bitterness festered. This wasn't just political, it was spiritual. And from that moment on, the Samaritans weren't just seen as outsiders, they were enemies. It was an act so unexpected, many saw it as fulfillment of divine prophecy. They retaliated. 10 tribes in the north broke away to form the kingdom of Israel, with Samaria as its capital. And neither side would ever again see the other as truly part of God's covenant. The northern kingdom, fearing that their people might return to Jerusalem and reunite with Judah during religious festivals, decided to build new places of worship in Bethel and Dan, and tried to halt the rebuilding of Jerusalem's walls. Their actions weren't just political, they were personal. This was the beginning of what some might call spiritual compromise. But it wouldn't stop there. The fall of Samaria and the birth of a new people and the Samaritans, stung by rejection and desperate to assert their own identity, made a fateful choice. They would build their own temple on their own mountain, Mount Gerizim. Fast forward a few generations, Israel, the northern kingdom, spirals deeper into idolatry and instability. In 720 BCE, the mighty Assyrian Empire launched a brutal siege on Samaria. Most of the population was deported, scattered across the empire like leaves in a storm. Now imagine what happens when a land is repopulated by strangers. Cultures clash, beliefs mingle, and slowly, a new identity forms. This is the moment the Samaritans, as we know them, are born, a people with partial Israelite roots, but infused with foreign blood and foreign gods. Judah's suspicion and the widening chasm. Meanwhile, down south, Judah endured for a time, and then something miraculous happened. The Persian king, Cyrus the Great, conquered Babylon and allowed the Jews to return and rebuild their temple, led by men like Zerubbabel and Nehemiah. The returning exiles came with a passion to restore what was lost, the city, the temple, and the purity of their worship. The Samaritans were still there, firmly rooted in the region, now with generations of identities shaped by mixed beliefs. We worship the same God, they said. Let us build with you. But the Jewish leaders refused, not because they were arrogant, but because they feared compromise, spiritual contamination. That refusal, that moment, created a wound that would bleed for centuries. A real-world parallel to this moment in biblical history reminds me of something I saw during a visit to a divided community. In the modern world, the situation between Jews and Samaritans wasn't that different. Rejection turned to resentment. Resentment fermented into hatred, sabotage, and separation. So what did the Samaritans do after that rejection? They tried to sabotage the reconstruction efforts. According to the book of Ezra, they sent false reports to the Persian king, bribed officials. It was as if both sides were saying, "You don't belong in our story anymore." Eventually, the temple was rebuilt, but the damage was done. From that moment forward, there were two temples, to places of worship, to peoples, once brothers, now rivals. By the time Jesus walked the roads of Galilee, the fracture between Jews and Samaritans had solidified into something far deeper than mere political division. It was spiritual, it was personal, it was ancient, and it was ugly, so much so that many observant Jews traveling from Galilee to Jerusalem would intentionally take a longer route just to avoid passing through Samaria. He walked right into Samaria, not just physically, but emotionally and spiritually. And what he did, that would turn thousands of years of conflict on its head. That's how intense the hatred was. Add to that the fact that she was a woman, alone, with a complicated past, and you realize just how radical this moment truly was. To most Jews in Judea and Galilee, Samaritans weren't just wrong, they were defiled, impure, heretics. But here's the fascinating twist. Jesus didn't follow that script. The woman at the well, more than a conversation, we've heard the story. A tired traveler, a woman drawing water, a life-changing conversation. But let's peel it back. Let us talk about one of the most iconic moments in the New Testament. Jesus and the Samaritan woman at the well, John 4. It was almost offensive. Imagine someone today telling a story where the hero is a member of a group your community considers dangerous or evil, maybe even an enemy. He doesn't bring up the centuries-old temple feud or the legitimacy of Mount Gerizim. Instead, he offers her what he calls living water. He sacrifices. Think about the parable of the Good Samaritan, one of the most well-known teachings in Christianity. First off, the mere fact that Jesus was speaking to a Samaritan was scandalous enough, but Jesus doesn't recoil. He doesn't judge. In her story, we see the broader story of Samaria, once part of Israel's heart, that pushed aside, branded as impure, and left spiritually thirsty for generations. Why? Because Jesus wasn't just mending a broken woman. He was symbolically bridging a broken people. They only accept the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of Moses, as scripture, and every year, they still celebrate Passover with actual sacrificial lambs. Just like in the time of Exodus. His name was Joseph, white beard, quiet eyes, weathered hands. We sat under a fig tree, and he told me something that stayed with me. They lived primarily into places on Mount Gerizim, near the city of Nablus biblical Shechem, and in a small community near Tel Aviv. And here, At that well, Jesus does what no king, priest, or prophet had done before. He sees her. What Yosef's quiet faith reminded me, the most sacred legacies are often the ones no one sees. Rewriting the narrative, just faithfulness. There's something profound in the way Jesus interacts with the Samaritans, and the response was overwhelming by the Jews, by the Christians, even by the world. But we have not forgotten our God. But here's what we often miss to Jesus' Jewish audience. Calling the Samaritan good was unthinkable. That's exactly what Jesus did, and once again, we're reminded that grace doesn't follow our boundaries. It flows where hearts are open. He flipped the expectation. The priest and the Levite, the religious elites, passed by the wounded man, but the Samaritan, he stops, he heals. Jesus wasn't just telling a nice moral tale. He was throwing a spotlight on prejudice, on religious pride, and on what real righteousness looks like, the forgotten remnant. But this raises a question. Whatever happened to the Samaritans? We still divide ourselves into insiders and outsiders, clinging to pride, heritage, or tradition as weapons instead of tools for healing. Most people assume they disappeared into history, like the Philistines or the Hittites, but the truth is more astonishing. They still exist. What if we stopped seeing people as enemies to be avoided and started seeing them as neighbors to be loved? Today, fewer than 1,000 Samaritans remain. That's not a metaphor. It's a census fact. They follow a religion they claim is the true continuation of ancient Israelite faith. Imagine that. In the 21st century, a people keeping a flame alive for thousands of years, in almost complete isolation, clinging to an identity shaped by exile, rejection, and rivalry, a real-world encounter. I'll never forget a conversation I had with a Samaritan elder during a visit to Mount Gerizim. We have been forgotten, he said. That sentence hit me like a thunderclap. In a world obsessed with being seen, liked, validated, here was a man who carried 1,700 years of spiritual legacy with no expectation of recognition. It made me reflect on how often we tie our value to external validation, subscribers, views, followers, applause. Samaritans and the early church now here. As something even more surprising, Samaritans were among the earliest groups to respond to the message of Jesus. In Acts chapter 8, we read that after persecution scattered the early believers, Philip, one of the 7 chosen deacons, went to Samaria and began preaching. Crowds gathered. Miracles happened. People were baptized. It was revival. Think about that. The very people rejected by Jerusalem became some of the first to embrace the gospel. There's something poetic about that. The stone the builders rejected, or in this case, the people the builders rejected, became part of the foundation for the early church. Modern echoes of an ancient conflict. The story of the Samaritans isn't just a historical curiosity. It's a mirror. Today, we still draw lines, sometimes with geography, other times with theology. Whether it's denominations, political ideologies, or cultural identities, the spirit of Samaria and Judah still lives in us. But what would happen if we started crossing those lines? Maybe then, like Jesus at the well, we'd offer living water to the very people we've been taught to reject. A prophetic shadow. There's something hauntingly prophetic about the story of the Samaritans. They are like a living ghost of Israel's past, walking relics of a kingdom torn in two. 8 people caught between heritage and heresy, between preservation and rejection, when pride of being chosen blinds a people to their calling. But they ray also a warning about what happens when tribal loyalty replaces spiritual truth, when political convenience erases covenant, and churches split not by heresy, but by ego, not through compromise of truth, but through radical compassion. Like Jesus showed to the woman at the well, it's as if the spirit of Jeroboam still whispers, tempting us to build new altars, to guard power at the cost of unity. And isn't that still happening today? We see it in religious infighting, in doctrinal battles that fracture communities. Yet through it all, the gospel offers a different way. Even in exile, the prophets spoke of a future restoration. And they shall become one in my hand, says the Lord. Ezekiel 37-17 legacy of division. Hope of restoration through people finding identity not in geography, but in grace. Let's revisit the big picture. 10 tribes went north. To remain in the south, the northern tribes formed what became Samaria. They built their own temple, crafted their own priesthood, rewrote parts of the Torah to fit their national story. The kingdom split after Solomon. He showed that even those written off by society still have a seat at God's table. And then came judgment, exile, scattering, and shame. But here's what's incredible. God didn't forget them. Ezekiel saw a vision of 2 sticks, one for Judah, one for Ephraim, representing the northern tribes, being joined together again. That's not just poetry, it's a promise. It wasn't political. It wasn't organized by governments. It was just young people, descendants of ancient enemies, sitting in a circle, sharing stories. We've all been misunderstood, misjudged, or mislabeled. Maybe we even carry shame from mistakes we've made, thinking we'll always be on the outside looking in. But now I'm here, hearing their pain, and realizing we've both been carrying the same fear that we may not see. And maybe, just maybe, it's already happening, not through politics or territory, but through hearts turning back to God. You're my neighbor, the Samaritan echo in us all. Here is the truth we rarely admit. Every one of us has a bit of Samaritan inside. We've all experienced rejection from our families, our churches, our communities. But the gospel says otherwise. Jesus didn't just tolerate the Samaritans. He intentionally sought them out. He invited them in. That's the beauty of grace. It doesn't erase our past, but it redefines it. Real life parallel, a modern reconciliation. Let me tell you a story. It's from just a few years ago in the hills near Mount Gerizim. A group of Jewish and Samaritan youth gathered for a reconciliation project. Maybe, like the Samaritan woman, you've drawn water alone, thinking no one sees you. One Samaritan teenager, Miriam, said this: "For my whole life, I thought they hated us, or far from people." Remember the Samaritan woman. Remember the rejected tribes. Remember the gospel that chose the outcast. And a Jewish boy, Levi, replied, "I was taught you weren't even real anymore, that you were just in the Bible. But now I know your name. You have a voice." That moment, that simple human exchange, did what centuries of politics couldn't. It reopened a channel of healing. The takeaway: from division to redemption. So what does this all mean for us today? It means that no division, however old or bitter, is beyond redemption. It means the labels we carry, Samaritan, outsider, reject, don't define us. Well, it means your past mistakes, your exile moments, your feelings of being cast off, they're not the end of your story. God is still writing. And just like with the Samaritans, He uses unlikely people, broken legacies, and forgotten places to shine the brightest truths. Maybe you felt overlooked. Maybe your faith has been bruised, but someone does. And He's not waiting for you to fix yourself first. He's offering living water. Today, the story of the Samaritans isn't just historical, it's deeply human. It shows us the pain of being divided and the beauty of being restored. It challenges us to rethink who we consider them and invites us to build bridges instead of walls. So the next time you feel far from God, because your story, like theirs, may just be the one that brings redemption to generations.